So we want to welcome everybody to our first Tuesdays with Heart. This is the second one that we're doing. We're so excited to have you all. Heart is the peer support program that we founded in 2020 in connection with the Resiliency and Justice Center, which is previously the Vegas Strong Resiliency Center. Heart stands for Healing, Empowering, and Rebuilding Together. We are now available for anyone who is impacted by any mass violence event. Real quick, we wanted to introduce the Heart team. Alice is our lead coach, and she also facilitates the Route 91 and UNLV support group meetings. Jackie, who unfortunately can't be with us today, is one of our original Heart coaches, and she is now the behavioral health program coordinator for the Resiliency and Justice Center. And I am a survivor of Route 91. I am the lead peer, and I also assist Alice with the UNLV support group meeting. We shared this last time, and I think it's really important to share. Healing is not linear. We are going to have good days and bad days. Hopefully, the good start outnumbering the bad, but it's really common for us to go in waves. So just a few housekeeping rules. We want to make sure that this program is only for people who were impacted by a mass violence event, whether you were directly there, first responders, hospital staffs, family, friends, etc. So we're going to ask anybody who does not fit in these categories to please remove yourself at this time. We want to make sure that this is a safe space for those who are impacted. We want to make sure that everyone's respectful of everyone in the group, and we don't share details of discussions with anyone outside of tonight's attendees. If you want to share information that Amy shares, please absolutely feel free to share that and the tools you learn. But as far as the discussion goes, again, we want this to be a safe space for all of us. The intention of our group is to learn and discuss our healing journey and challenges we may encounter. So because of that, we will not be discussing the details of our events themselves, as we don't want to activate others. It is fine to share that you were, at Route, at Columbine, Boston Marathon, but just no details. As Alice mentioned, we'll be recording the presentation portion of tonight's meeting, but we will not record the discussion. If you'd like to speak, please go ahead and raise your hand under the reactions in the Zoom toolbar and wait to be called on. Because there's so many of us, we don't want people to try to be talking over each other. And if you would please mute yourself when you're not talking. And no politics, no controversial, anything like that. We want this to be a safe, productive space. We're incredibly excited to have Amy O'Neill joining us. Amy has been a licensed professional counselor for over 30 years supporting the Pennsylvania area. She's also a consultant and a Boston Marathon bombing survivor. She's done numerous presentations for different organizations and has really been an advocate for all of us survivors. She's provided support in several communities faced with mass violence, and she's an adjunct instructor at Chestnut Hill College Graduate Studies Program and is also a doctoral candidate. And we're thrilled to say that Amy is also one of our very first Heart coaches. So I've had the pleasure of hearing Amy speak several times, and she's incredibly inspirational. So I'm really glad that we were able to get her on to be able to share her experience and her journey with you guys. Amy?
So I just wanted to start with thanking Jill and Alice for all they do on behalf of people that have been impacted by mass violence, survivors, victims, and however you choose to identify. And it's such a labor of love, and you're stepping into a space that can be really challenging, and it really takes a lot to be willing to do so. So thank you for all that you do for everyone. And I just want to start with saying I called this conversation, and I really would love it to be a conversation. I called it Finding My Place, because when I reflect back 10 years on, whether it's 3 days or, 10 days or 10 years later. We just had our 10 years last year. For me, it really has been about finding your place. And I just want to say that this time tonight together, in my mind, is for anyone who suffered in any way due to mass violence. And there's just want to start by saying, when we are thinking about the presentation today, just to be realizing that there are so many different factors that influence all of our individual journeys, and try not to judge or compare yourself against anybody else's, because they're all uniquely and distinctly different. And each of us are our own unique person, and who we are really matters a lot in terms of how we're impacted. So I'll just start by briefly saying, this is a picture of me and two of my really good friends the night before the marathon in 2013. And I had a dream to run the Boston Marathon. This was something that, as an athlete and a runner, was a long-term dream of mine. And this was my first Boston Marathon. Fortunately, it was not my last, despite the events that happened. And just since this talk is going to include speaking about resilience and post-traumatic growth, I just want to share that last year in 2023, I should have switched the picture. My son ran with me, who's 20 years old. So it was a really impactful and important moment, even 10 years on in my experience. So finding my place. I think most people feel this way. I think a lot of us feel this way. I know that this really speaks to me, that there's life before and life after, right? We all think about, I think many of us tend to think about our life before that day, that moment that changed your life, and life after starts within minutes or seconds of that life-changing moment in time. And that innocence, or the freedom, or the sense of safety that we had before our event occurred, at least for me, really changed in that moment instantaneously. And for me, I can remember standing there thinking something really awful and tragic has just happened, and that immediate sense of what now and what next. And then for, once we're impacted by this event, this moment in time that changes your life forever. And it's such a dramatic and noticeable and insidious and overt and covert change. And it's really confusing. And again, I'm going to go back to calling this talk Finding My Place. I think so much of what we go through as people impacted by mass violence, and I'm going to say people impacted because victim, survivor, I think is a really individual way to identify. So just in terms of, for me, I just, I'm going to say person impacted, but just know that that means victim, survivor, and person impacted. But going back to that moment that changes your life forever, I think so much of the journey, at least for me, is that's what it is about. Because we have life before, life after takes time to get there. So moving into life after, I call it the messy in between, because I think before we understand what's really happening, and before we get there, there's a lot that we end up going through. And that moment that changes your life, it impacts you. It impacted me in ways, again, sometimes they're covert, sometimes they're overt. Not only are we impacted in our thoughts and feelings and beliefs about the world, but how it impacts our family, and how it impacts people that we love, and how it impacts society as a whole. And I think one of the things that's really challenging, and even 10 years on, I can go back to day one, people saying the wrong thing. You're so lucky. You're one of the lucky ones. And that, I think from the outset, just contributes to the confusion of how do we find our place once we have gone through this incident. And for me, my view of the world changed, thinking about, having this dream the night before the marathon. I'm there with two of my best girlfriends and we have plans on what we're going to do after. And it's completely unimaginable, as it is for people attending a concert, a movie, and school. And unfortunately, it's become less unimaginable over time. And that's why what Alice and Jill and the folks at Heart are doing is so important, so that we have places and opportunities to learn from each other. Part of our mission today is to also talk about resilience. So some of that resilience comes from being willing to connect and talk with others. And I think as people impacted, at least for me, I know that I was searching for something in the immediate aftermath. I did not know what that was, but I knew it was something. I wanted to feel something. I needed to know something. I was looking for language. I was looking for validation. I was looking for a place to feel understood. There's so many different aspects to what it is that somebody's searching for. And I think that's part of what I've learned from having the opportunity to talk with people from around the world, is that that's something we have in common. And I think sometimes we find what we're searching for in each other. And that's why peer support, social support, and opportunities to learn and connect with other people become part of what constitutes resilience in the aftermath. For me, the day after, I remember, and I think probably anybody on this call can, what it's like to be sitting there. And I've sent my children to school and I'm sitting in my kitchen and not trusting my own mind. What just happened? How did this happen? The shock, the strangeness. I don't know how other people felt, and I'd be curious to see if people want to put it in the chat, but what that was like for you. I didn't know how to move forward. And on one hand, we get up and we go, right? If we're able to, but what does that mean? And what am I doing? I remember going to an event at the school. My kids were in elementary school, and standing there, and my leg was bandaged. I had been to the hospital the day before. I was scheduled for surgery a week later. And I was standing there like with this strange feeling, not knowing feeling very alone. Nobody there could be understanding what's going on inside my mind. And it's really an out of body experience in some ways, I think. But looking for that affirmation that our feelings matter and that our experience matters. And I think that I just want to say, in terms of resilience, don't stop searching. And then how do we fit into our lives? And how do we fit into the victim and survivor community? I know for me, I didn't live in Boston. I lived in Pennsylvania. So I came back to my home area, and I would hear that there was things going on there. I wasn't involved in everything. There was so much stress and confusion around, well, how do we get connected to people? And how do I not feel alone? One of the other aspects that I think is important to identify for me was this fear, this overwhelming internal fear I had about, if I told people I was upset, I was bothered, I was confused, I had this extreme fear about feeling weak. I don't want to feel weak. I don't want to feel like something's wrong with me. I don't want to feel like a victim. I had a real aversion to that. And if I had a dime for every time I said I feel weak in therapy, I wouldn't have to work. But one of the things I've come to learn that I'm happy to share is that saying that I feel weak is a way to my brain to protect me from the trauma, from what you saw, from what you experienced. It changes the conversation in our mind from, I'm afraid to think about the things that, are going through my mind. So I feel weak is a way to protect us in that moment. The feelings, somebody said to me one time, if you had to say how you felt in one word, what would it be? And I said, easy. I didn't even have to think about it. Lonely. In a lot of ways, for me, it was the most lonely experience. And even though I was surrounded by people, family, friends, I had a spouse at the time, there was a real loneliness there, and it's really hard when you don't have the words to express the emotions, and you may not even have a way to describe them. I think that contributes to the loneliness. I also highlighted the word helpless because that sense of helplessness is one of the worst things that we can experience. And there's a real helplessness there. If you go to run a marathon and this thing happens, it's confusing. I can't control what's happening in the world. I can't control how I'm feeling. And that sense of helplessness leads to survivor guilt and leads to guilt and leads to shame. And helplessness is the one of the worst things we can be. And I love some of the writings by Galit Atlas, and I read one of her books and I emailed her and said, I have to talk to you. You wrote about helplessness. I want to know more. And she was so generous and got on a Zoom meeting with me. And, one of the ways she described helplessness is it's our brain's way of protecting us. Because if I'm mad at myself, if I feel guilty or shame, that's better than feeling like I have no control at all. I can problem solve guilt and shame. I can't problem solve helplessness. So I thought that was a very interesting little nugget of information from her. And a friend that I met through my travels, he described his experience poetic, sadly poetic, I guess, right? He said a piece of me was stolen. And I said, yes, that's another way to capture that before and after and who we are in the in between. And I kept thinking about what he said, and it led me to this aha moment for myself, which is the grief. There's so much grief in the in between. We've lost something, who I am before, how I thought about life in the world before. And I didn't think about it as grief and mourning. And there's a lot of grief and mourning that goes on. So there's loss on top of loss on top of loss. And other phrases that I've heard that were powerful and meaningful to me: anger is the bodyguard for sad. Again, anger feels like something I can do something about. Sad feels overwhelming. And asking ourselves unanswerable questions. Why me? Why us? Are we going to be forgotten? And I've heard that from lots of people around the world. And so many things keep happening that there's this real fear about being forgotten. So there's lots of other fears too, like, going to a race, going to school, being in crowded spaces, those things that lots of us have in common, but also the fear of being forgotten. And so what do we do about that? To me, it made sense. It's a moving through. The grief is happening, the loss is happening, life is reshaping, and we have to get to know ourselves after. Who we were and how we thought about the world before has changed. And now grief, mourning, we're losing something that's in between. So again, part of this resilience and part of the post-traumatic growth is, how do I get to know myself? And that's a big part of the journey. So if you're, 2 days, 2 months out, 6 months out, you're probably in this grief and mourning and confusion and anger. And depending on how you engage with that, or how we engage with that over time, we're in this process of developing and growing. And I hope that that's hopeful, because there is a path, and we just need to go through it. And I remember it was such an epiphany. I thought, oh, okay, there's no going back. That's why it's not working. I'm not going back. There's no reset button back to 4:15, 13, 2:50, 8 p.m. That there's no going back. So now it's about, how do I figure it out? And for some people, and it was for me in a lot of ways, another phrase that made a lot of sense to me is, trauma can be an annihilation. And I thought, yes, when I heard that, yes, 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 yes to that. And the reason why is because all the things that worked for me before in terms of resilience weren't working. Doing it all, being superhuman, figuring it out by myself. And even though I'm a therapist, worked in mental health for 30 years, I had a problem with going to therapy. I was like, and it was this weak thing. Does this, what does that mean if I go there? Just something wrong with me? Can I still work? Can I still be who I thought I was? So, one of the ways that was helpful for me in learning how to deal with that was, again, this not so complicated idea that seemed to be this great epiphany, which was that you can be two things at one time. I can I can be a good mother. I can be good at my job. I can function and figure out how to move forward while I was carrying this grief and mourning and working through the sad part of what would happen. And I thought, yeah, you can, that's true. That's right. We can be two things at one time. And I think in the strangeness of mass violence and what it is and how we try to understand what's happened, at least for me, sometimes we don't trust our own minds to really know what you feel or why you feel that way. And that's why, having opportunities to talk to other people that have been impacted can be really helpful. And I think, I know the Mass Violence Resource Center is in the process of working on some really incredible research that talks about this greater, broader impact in communities. And, this is what we're learning. And this is what, I had the opportunity to hear Angie Moreland Johnson talk at a conference about some of this research and rippling deep into communities, people are impacted. So the fact that there's now data that's going to be validating what we already know and what we already feel, I think is going to be even more validating for us. And it doesn't even matter necessarily. It does matter, the proximity, and it doesn't, right? So if I was in the space, if I was a witness, if I was in a building, if I was a family member of, one of the things that she was talking about at this conference event is that in the ripples of people impacted, there's impact. So it's good to know that that's being validated and that people can take that information and use that to keep searching and learning to connect with other people and to be open to that. So, again, this darkness in between, and that requires resilience. And part of the resilience that to me makes a lot of sense is that psychological flexibility and the willingness to trust your mind, even when it feels like we can't, and not to stop searching. Look for people to talk to listen to. When you hear things, statements or phrases that are meaningful to you, take them, grab them, listen, explore it and see how that's going to help you get to know yourself. Another phrase that I heard from Galit Atlas and also Judith Herman, she's another trauma researcher, is, talking about that tension between life and death, right? And that's there's multiple levels of that. That's that annihilation. It could be emotional or psychological death. It could be the mourning, the loss of that version of ourselves, and it can be loss. It can be traumatic grief when you've been impacted in that dramatic way as well. So, and that conflict is an attempt to sometimes deny that horrible event or figure out how to come to terms with that horrible event. And that that to some degree is what psychological trauma is, right? So, that process helps us look at our feelings and looking for that validation that we're talking about. And for some people, like for me, I was called to go to therapy. And, for many people, most people will come through these events without significant adverse mental health outcomes. And those of us that need more, we get more, and we ask for help, and we find the help that we need. And, when I called for therapy, and I left a message on her machine, and I said, I am calling, I'd like to make an appointment with you, and here's why. And I said it in this order: my marriage is in a really bad place. So, and I'm going to bookmark that and come back to it in just a minute. There's some childhood stuff that I don't think I've sorted out. And I was in the bombing. So I buried the lead that I was in this horrific event last week, because it's exactly what happens. The fact that my marriage was in a bad place and there was other stuff that I hadn't worked out was highly activated in this most recent trauma of the bombing. So that, again, I thought I was discovering something amazing in research, but come to find out this was already a thing, and other people knew that this happened. So, and it's complicated, because in some ways it makes you wonder if your experience at your MDI is dramatic as you think it is. And the answer is, if it impacts you, it impacts you, and no need to judge yourself on that impact. So that goes into that understanding who you are before the attack. And there's some dark moments. There were some days of, I remember laying in bed one day thinking, my marriage is really crumbling. I don't know who I am. And if not waking up tomorrow would be okay. I mean, not that I wanted to hurt myself, but I remember thinking this is a lot, and it was lonely, and all the things that I already shared. But so redefining the way that I felt about myself, the way I was coping, and how I felt about how I was coping was helpful, as is having hope and self-compassion. And, it's a simple little strategy, right? But if somebody else told us our story, we would have a ton of compassion for them. But when it's ourselves, for some reason, we come up short often. And that takes us back to finding our place. And for me, resilience and post-traumatic growth is getting to know the new version of me after this incident, after the event, after the way it impacted my marriage and family. And that marriage and family piece is important to bookmark, because, again, with some of the research that I've heard Angie talk about, social support matters a lot. So who do you have to talk to? Who do you have that's there for you that you can trust? And do you feel safe in your space after you've been through something? Those are all really important questions. And all that helps us to really process the impact of our trauma and our past wounds, and how that influenced our experience. And then for me, connecting with other people and living with questions that have no answers. It doesn't, at some point for me, it didn't matter why me. It just mattered that it happened. And now how I'm gonna engage with that. And I do realize that I'm saying that 10 years on. And I can tell you that 10 weeks and 10 months, I would have been in a different part of that process. And that's exactly what it is a process. Peer connections, being stronger together, was really helpful for me over the last 10 years. Redefining myself, the way I saw myself, sort of that life after that I introduced in the beginning. Again, phrases that I've collected from people in my 10-year journey. I heard Alyssa Reingold say in a conversation, learning to carry it lightly. And I thought I loved the way that sounded. You're not getting over something. You're not putting something behind you. You're carrying it lightly. And how heavy it is might depend on where you are in your process, right? It may have been, and at different times in life in the world, depending on what's going on, it may get heavy at different times, right? I said I called for therapy, and I said my marriage was in a bad place, and eventually I got divorced, and it was heavier then, right? So at different times in your life, the things that activate you might get heavy. And there's ways to find people, retreats, conferences, peer connections, peer groups, opportunities to work in advocacy if you've taken care of yourself. And by doing all these things, by engaging in opportunities and learning from others, we get to feel more understood. We get to understand ourselves better, and we're less alone and lonely. And that brings us into life after, right? It's, again, I had one of these experiences where somebody said, okay, I forget what year marker it was. It might have been, it was after 5. Somebody said, okay, what's one word you would choose to pick in terms of resilience? And I said, oh, it's a transformation. So the knowledge that this was transformative to me was resilience. Like, okay, I got to buddy up with the fact that there's change happening. So that was power to know that it was a transformation, and that the change, yeah, there were some people that you lost along the way, and it becomes okay. So 10 years on, how do we fit in, and what do we need for each year marker? Changes at every year for every person in every situation. Expectations are that we're going to do the things people say and it's going to get better. And reality is, I, maybe didn't plan on getting divorced or plan on all the other things that happened, but they happened, but the arrow still ends up in the same space. So, we have different needs at different times. There were some years I went to every year marker celebration, and there were some years when I didn't go anywhere near anything going on. There were some years when, one year I think I skipped the events and got a tattoo. One year I spent the time alone. One year I went back and ran the marathon. So every year was different, and it's difficult to trust yourself in that. It feels there's pressure from your community of folks that you went through stuff with to do certain things, and just, it's okay to do whatever makes sense to you. I think a lot of the things that I talked about, again, fit into these 3 phases of recovery. And it starts with, how do I get safe? How do I get safe in my body? How do I get safe in my mind? How do I get safe in my environment? And how do I get safe with people around me? And then by doing that, I can do what I need to do in terms of the mourning and remembering and the going through. And then, that leads us into the reconnection, and that's the transformation. So the old beliefs that got destroyed in this process became, part of developing new meaning in my life. And some relationships are better, some relationships have changed, some expired, and I've built some really incredible new ones. And the ultimate transformation or post-traumatic growth is that fresh perspective on not only your identity, how you carry your victimization, survivorship, or impact, and how we think about the experiences that shaped us, how we were challenged to evolve and grow, and ultimately how we changed. And, even 10 years on, I'm still changing. So it's fascinating. And when I get in these little dark spells, I know now, I'm like, oh, I'm changing again. Something's happening again in my life. It's shifting. And there's a power in that knowledge that that's what that is. At least that's what it is for me. Whenever I hit these real dark spells, and there's been some darkness. I mean, I've lost my mother recently. My father's ill. My family didn't do well after my mom passed away. I mean, there's, it's, life never stops. So that two things at one time, how do I carry this and continue, to go through life on life's terms? Because I don't get to decide, and also again with that resilience, like bad things happen to good people. There's no reason why bad things happen. It just is. So there's some power in that, sort of the acceptance of that and leaning into it, rather than the unanswerable question. And it's a distortion in our mind that if we're good, this shouldn't have happened. Bad things happen to good people all the time, unfortunately. And just another lesson for me is that your body doesn't let you forget what your mind needs to know. So that anxiousness, the churning, the looking, the desire, we feel it. And listen to it, listen to that little voice. It's giving us direction. It's trying to communicate something that maybe we haven't found the words yet. And I love this phrase too. And I find it very helpful in terms of the resilience and post-traumatic growth. And that's that the monster in your mind, the monster is in your mind because the worst thing already happened. And if we're here and we're having this conversation, we've made it through the worst thing, that moment in time. And we probably have more resilience and grit than we realize at times, which I get. I've been there, down on my knees, laying in bed, not wanting, thinking it's okay if this is my day, like, okay. But by continuing to keep moving forward and being willing to listen and searching and learning and trying to name things, again, we get to keep ourselves moving into the after. And reminder from our friend Mark Green, you are not the darkness you endured, but you're the light that refused to surrender. And it can get pretty dark, right? And I think most of us can relate to that in some way, shape, or form. And I think other people's inability to understand what it is that we're also trying to figure out can make it feel even more dark at times. And back to that self-compassion, back to not judging, and back to not comparing what you went through to what anybody else went through. Because don't forget, we all have we're all carrying our own experiences of who we are coming into this. So, I was in the second explosion. I had some physical injuries. And you know what? If I didn't have other childhood trauma, if my marriage wasn't in a horrible place, I may have come through that differently. I may have been able to sort of just be like, okay, something really awful happened, and have sort of a normative experience for an abnormal situation, but those other factors were there. And so I may have had a harder time than somebody who had way more physical injuries. And I know people who had no physical injuries who had a way more challenging time than I did. So not comparing, and that self-compassion is really important. And then I think just questions to take away are, finding your place. Do you know your place? Are you finding your place? Do you have support in your process of finding your place? Who can you talk with? And self-compassion. It's a heavy burden to figure out how to carry. So, we want to be asking ourselves these questions about, our place and what it is that's going to help us kind of get through that messy in between, from the before to the after. And then, the resilience and the post-traumatic growth is really in the journey, and being willing to just sort of keep going and keep asking and keep talking. And And if, you ask these questions, who do you have support and who can you talk with? If there isn't anybody, I know what that's like. That's probably part of why I ended up in the situation I was. I didn't have anybody that I felt I could go talk with. And I am a mother. I was, for me, I was trying to protect my children. I wanted to be fine. And I also wanted to live up to the everybody around me that was like, you're so strong, you're so strong. So it was important to find people to talk with to help me find my place. And that is what I've got. I think I'm right on time. So I want to stop sharing and just thank everybody for listening and giving me an opportunity to talk a little bit about my personal experience and what I've been through.